Excuse me. I'm going to start off today and kick off this session talking a little bit about an introduction to research and what are some definitions of different types of research, what are the pros and cons to volunteering in research, what are the safeguards for people that decide to volunteer and be participants in research, and talk a little bit at the end, if I have time, about what are some of the important things, therapies that are at the forefront of clinical trials that may be coming out soon to the market. So I am actively involved in research. I'm a principal investigator in a number of clinical trials looking at therapies to try to advance treatment in Parkinson's disease. So over the last number of years, I've worked with a lot of pharmaceutical companies as an investigator. I speak mostly for CME. I'm not on a speaker bureau for any pharmaceutical companies, but I have been actively involved in research in trying to develop new therapies. So when we talk about clinical research, what do we mean? This is a very broad term that encompasses a lot of different types of research. And in general, clinical research itself means that with the help of human volunteers, we try to gain more knowledge and try to move the needle forward about what we knew about health and disease. And there are many different types of research, but the NIH and the FDA break it up into two large categories, those being observational trials, which, as the name implies, means that we're actually not actively intervening or doing anything, but rather we're observing communities and groups of people as to things like lifestyle factors, nutrition, where they live, personality traits, and even how they use healthcare resources to see if we can understand a little bit more about why certain people get diseases, how it changes the course of disease. And so we don't actually intervene, but we research these groups in observation. Clinical trials or interventional trials are a little bit different. Here we introduce an intervention to try to change the course of a disease, either prevent it from occurring or maybe change how it progresses or maybe find better treatments to treat a condition. So when we talk about clinical trials, we talk about trials with human research participants in trying to find new medical interventions that are safe and effective for use in people. And when we talk about intervention, it doesn't always necessarily mean a medication or a drug. It could be a device that's used in surgery. It can be a screening test that is used to better pick up at an earlier time a condition. It can be a diagnostic test to more accurately diagnose a disease. It could be a certain type of physical therapy, other type of therapy, or diet as a treatment. Or we could be looking at quality of life, how a certain intervention might not just affect the symptoms, but more their quality of life, in addition to medications and devices and different types of medical therapies. So the FDA imposes very strict processes and long processes for us to try to develop new therapies that can take a long time and many years, but it actually helps us decide if a medication or therapy is effective and is safe to use in humans. And so it many times requires multiple different phases to try to test this medication in increasing number of people. All therapies usually start with an idea, what we call a hypothesis, either from knowing the biology of disease. We decide there's maybe a certain medication or therapy that might change a condition, knowing the biology, or we observe something in an observational trial that says maybe this intervention might be able to change the course. So we start first with that idea and develop that idea. If it's a medication or device, we may go into the lab and try to develop it or build it. And once that's done, then this therapy goes into what we call preclinical studies. Preclinical studies, and I'll go ahead and introduce and talk a little bit about all these phases, is trying to see if the idea that the researcher or group has just come up with actually works in non-human sort of mediums. And then if they decide that it does work, we move it on to more and more intense phases that involve human volunteers to test it and see if it's a viable therapy that then can be brought out to the market. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all those different phases. So when we talk about a therapy that has been developed or has been a hypothesis that has come about and we develop the therapy, it then goes into preclinical testing. And preclinical testing is not human testing. It can be in a certain group of cells or an animal that models the disease. For example, in Parkinson's disease, we have different cell groups, or there are different animal models that mimic some of the physical symptoms that people with Parkinson's disease can have. So they take that therapy and they use them in these models to see if it works and if it doesn't cause any toxicity to the cells or the animals. And so we're here trying to establish, and they give it at different doses, and they're trying to establish if the therapy is safe and at what doses it may work, and make sure that there's no toxic side effects from it in these mediums. If that happens, if it's positive and no toxicity is noted and it seems to have an effect, then the company or the entity or the researcher that is developing this files with the FDA what we call an IND, or investigational new drug or device. And basically it's telling the FDA, we've done this testing, it looks very promising, we'd like to move it on to human trials. The FDA reviews all this, and if it looks good to them and it's safe and not toxic, then they'll allow the trial to move forward. And then we enter the first couple of phases of human trials with human volunteers. Phase 1 is the very first milestone that all therapies must go through. The main objective here is looking for safety and trying to find doses that are effective. Generally, this is done with small groups of patients, usually less than 100. In the majority of these types of trials, these are healthy volunteers that volunteer for the sake of science and helping advance science, but occasionally it will be groups of people with a certain condition, and they're exposed to certain doses or levels of a therapy, looking for safety, make sure there's no side effects. What is the dose that people start feeling an effect, and a dose that maybe there's a toxic effect, and make sure that there's no side effects. And they also do blood tests to see how in humans, how this drug reacts, how it's metabolized by the body, any other effects that we can see that maybe are not clinical, but maybe it's reaction in the body. If this is positive and it seems to be safe, and seems to have some effect, then it moves on to the second phase, what we call phase 2. This is what we call a therapeutic exploratory trial. It's a larger group of patients, usually patients that have the condition that we're looking at here and trying to study. And again, we're trying to look for more efficacy at this point. Does it work in humans? And we continue to monitor for safety. So in a larger group with a condition, is it effective? What's the dose that it's effective at? What's the toxic ceiling where maybe people start having some side effects to it? And then we try to hone in on the doses that potentially could be used for further trials. So we usually break this up into A and B phase 2 trials. You'll sometimes see that written in the literature. A is they're looking at different doses to see if they work and where do people start having side effects. And then the B trial is where we're looking to see, once we've identified those doses, how effective they are. If phase 2 is positive, then we move to phase 3. Phase 3, these are large trials. They're what we call therapeutic confirmatory trials. These are done in much larger groups of people, usually hundreds of people with the condition that we're trying to study. And we're looking for efficacy, how well this drug works, as well as still continuing to monitor for any side effects or toxicity. And many times at this point, we're comparing the therapy to maybe the therapy that's already out there, see if it works better than the therapy that's already out there, or they may compare it to placebo to see if it really has an effect or not. And so these are long trials with large groups of people at this point. And if these results are positive, then many times the entity that's studying it, whether it's a pharmaceutical or a biotech company or individual research group, if this result is positive and shows a significant effect versus placebo or versus the standard therapy, then the entity may file for what's called a new drug or device application, meaning that we've gone through all the testing that the FDA requires, it's safe, it's effective, and we'd like to try to bring this drug to the market. And that's usually, these are the studies that the FDA uses to try to decide if this patient should be released out for sale to the population. Now, sometimes they also will do what's called phase 4 testing. So if the FDA thinks that there might be some hidden toxicity or there was some side effect that they'd like to keep in a closer monitoring, they sometimes will do what's called phase 4 testing. This is after the drug is approved, but goes out and is being prescribed. There's what we call phase 4, and they're trying to see what the medication or the therapy does out in the real world. When we talk about clinical trials, we talk about a very controlled environment. We look for certain people that are healthy, that there's no contraindication with other medications that they're on, or other comorbidities or other medical illnesses that maybe can't be in the clinical trial. And now all of a sudden you open it up to a more real world situation and see how that drug or therapy does out in the real world, and the FDA and the entity who's trying to bring it to market is monitoring to see if, and this is usually more long-term study, and see how the therapy does over the long term. So those are the phases that we use that the FDA requires for any medication or any therapy that comes to market must go through all these phases, which is a long, arduous, and actually very expensive process, which is one of the reasons why sometimes medications can be very costly, because we talk about on the orders of millions or billions sometimes in testing these therapies over a decade or a decade and a half. So what if you decide to participate in research trials? You know, obviously a lot of people are fearful of the potential risks of being a research volunteer, or have read stories of in the past of problems or risks that volunteers might have been exposed to. And so there is levels of safeguards on multiple fronts that try to make these tests, these trials, safe for volunteers and keep people as safe as we possibly can. One of the first things that comes to mind is all research that is done and is mandated by the FDA to be tested follows 3 ethical principles. And when we develop protocols and we think about putting anybody through trials, there's 3 main ethical principles that must be considered. That is respect for the volunteers that are participating. So making sure that people are autonomous, they know all the information that is available about the drug that happened during testing, that they understand everything that is needed of them, that they understand that it's voluntary, that at any point they can come out of a trial if they don't like what's happening or something happens in their life and they need to pull out. So, and make sure that they are abreast of everything that is happening during the trial. So respect for people being informed about everything that they're being exposed to. What we call beneficence, so this is where when we're deciding on trials, how do we weigh benefits of risks? So does the benefit of going through this trial and potentially bringing this drug to market outweigh the risk? So if there's a little bit of risk, are we thinking that this drug will bring something positive to society and people that deal with the condition that we're testing? And lastly, justice, that everybody can be involved at the trial that wants to and that meets the criteria, that we don't exclude people, and that everybody has the ability, if they want to be part of it. So those are the 3 guiding principles that we use in all types of research. Then there's something that the protocol, anything that's being studied follows a very strict protocol, and this is a very lengthy document that talks about what exactly the drug is, what its results have been in preclinical and early tests. So it'll just talk about how animals reacted, how people in the early studies reacted, were there any side effects that occur. It'll talk a little bit about who can participate and who cannot. For example, if they have certain conditions or if they're on certain medications, sometimes people can't participate in a trial, even if they have the condition that we're studying. It'll tell all the tests and visits and have a schedule of everything that is going to be done during the study, and as well as what the goal of our study, how long we're going to be studying. So that's what we call the study protocol. There is the informed consent process. Now, the informed consent is not just solely a document that says, I want to participate. It is a process of communication between the researcher and anybody who volunteers. Initially, when somebody comes in, it is our obligation to let you know everything we know about the drug, everything that we're looking for, what's the reason that we want you to participate, what are the potential risks, how often do we need to see you, as I said, and that it's completely voluntary. And we ask you to acknowledge that you understand this and sign at the paper. But it also is a continual communication that if we learn anything new as the study is going on, that we have an obligation to tell you everything and keep you informed about any changes in the study or changes that we learn during the study. This is all that is done prior to anybody coming into the study. There are different organizations that keep the study on track and make sure that everything is proceeding the way it should. Institutional review boards, or what we call IRBs, are committees that are made up of medical personnel and community people that are not in the medical field. They review the protocol, they review what the entity wants to study, they make sure that the therapy is safe and that we're following ethical principles, and they continue to follow along the stages to make sure that people aren't being exposed to unnecessary risk and make sure that the researcher is communicating any new findings. And then, of course, there's federal oversight. There's a number of organizations and different sort of regulations that make sure that research is being done in an ethical and safe way. Sometimes they will do spontaneous audits if they feel that something's not going the way it should, and constantly looking at documentation to make sure that people are kept safe and the trials are proceeding the ways they should be. So who pays for all these clinical studies? Well, there's a number of different entities. Definitely the federal government pays for a lot of research in this country, not only the National Institute of Health, but the Department of Defense, the Department of Veteran Affairs, environmental agencies within the government. There's a number of different organizations that have their specific grants. They look at protocols that are brought forth by entities and decide if it has merit, if it would be a benefit to society, as well as if it's safe to proceed into human trials. Pharmaceutical or biotech companies, what we call industry, also fund a lot of the therapies that are coming to market and being studied. University medical centers and hospitals, sometimes individual researchers, investigator-led trials that come up with an idea as part of their research, and they will go and seek funding at some of these, but sometimes the institution themselves will fund them. And then there's also nonprofit agencies or foundations, such as the APDA, the Parkinson's Disease Foundation, Michael J. Fox Foundation, all as well help fund research and move science forward. So there's a variety of organizations and entities that help fund research. So some of you here may have volunteered before. Some of people may like the idea but don't know too much about it or feel a little bit insecure. Some people read about it but decide they don't want to volunteer. What are the pros and cons to being a research volunteer? Well, there are risks associated, but there also can be a lot of gain, and definitely volunteers are greatly needed. The pros being that you might be able to gain access to therapies that are not out there just yet. And so you may be able to find a therapy that could be useful, that could help your condition, and you might get an early foot in the door before everybody else. That's one. Two is you also could, as part of this, you usually have more frequent visits with the physician, doctor, the investigator, and the team, and so you get more care than you normally would do in your every 3-month visit with your physician, so there's more people sort of monitoring you and watching you through this time. You learn a lot about your condition. That's one thing that I've learned in the years that I've been doing research is that all the people that I come across maybe know they have Parkinson's, but they're not in tune to some of the little things that go along with Parkinson's. And as they're keeping diaries and they're doing these tests and they're looking more at what they go through, they start learning more about their Parkinson's and recognizing certain symptoms or certain things that help or make things worse. And so you learn more about your condition. Above all that is that you're helping science move forward, and you may or may not find something that helps for you, but you may be able to help future generations so that maybe we can find better therapies, or even better yet, find something that arrests or cures Parkinson's disease. And we can only do that if we have people that help us together in trying to find that. Now, that's wonderful, but there are always drawbacks. There's always risks, and it's very important to know that. Treatments that are studied aren't always better. You know, there are a lot of trials that go on that sometimes the medication is not effective. It's not better than what we have available, so you may not notice a difference. There's a 30 to 50% chance that you may be on placebo and maybe not even taking the active therapy, and that's necessary for our trial because we don't know if something works or doesn't work if we don't compare it to something. So unfortunately, a population of patients do have to be on not the active therapy. Like I mentioned, you get more attention from the staff and the physician investigator, which is good, but it also means you have to go there more often and travel and timing of medication. So it is a little bit of a burden for people, or can be. And of course, there's always the potential for side effects. There are ones that we know of from prior phases, but occasionally there can be unexpected side effects. The good thing is that you are monitored very closely, and should we have any unwanted side effects, we can act on it very quickly, and usually you can access the staff that are doing trials very quickly when you do have a problem. So how do you find out about clinical trials? Well, there's a number of resources. Your doctor and your healthcare team sometimes are attuned to what you might be out in the community, or they themselves may be doing research. The local Parkinson support groups, many times there are members in the support group where people are doing research or may know about local research. And then there's a variety of web resources to organizations that will have listings. The Michael J. Fox Foundation, Center Watch, clinicaltrials.gov, all of them will talk about the different types of trials and their phases, what they're looking for in research participants, and give you information about different trials that are active in your area. Clinicaltrials.gov is actually a government website where any trial that's being done on human volunteers must be listed here. So it'll give you everything that is being done throughout the country, sometimes even outside of the country, and you can sort of advance your search so you can find out in your local area. So I just put in a screenshot for those that have never gone to clinicaltrials.gov, and you can do an advanced search and put in the condition Parkinson's disease, and you're looking for interventional trials. You can also look at observational trials if you don't want to be in an interventional trial. There's a listing for observational trials if you want to participate in that, and you can put in the phases that you're looking for, and it will bring up a listing of all the trials that are being done throughout the country, or you can even refine it to your local area. Last I looked, I think there were like 32 phase 3 trials that were occurring in Parkinson's disease. Sometimes they're general Parkinson's disease, or they can hone in on a certain symptom, depression or cognition or drops in blood pressure or something like that. So you can look for certain things that they're testing. So I'm not going to hone in too much on this because I think Dr. Tan is going to be talking about this, but there's a number of very interesting compounds that are being researched right now that are in phase 3 trials or just finishing up phase 3 trials that may show success and come out to market. And Dr. Tan will be talking a little bit more about those. As I mentioned, this is a long and arduous process that takes a long time, decade and a half, and is very expensive to bring these drugs to market, which is why sometimes they can be expensive and why sometimes it takes so long. We don't seem to have a lot of drugs coming out in a fast enough manner, and this is the reason why. There is a new area of research recently that has been gaining a lot of attention. It's something that we call drug repurposing, and this is where we test a therapy that is already approved maybe for another condition, and we use it and test it for a different condition. And some examples of that are things like Viagra. Viagra was initially tested as an antihypertensive, and they found that a small population of men actually had improvement in their erectile dysfunction, and wow, so then they went and tested it for that. And so it's different than what it was originally intended for. And we either identify these just because as we learn more about Parkinson's and diseases, we find a mechanism and we say, oh wow, we have a drug that already does that mechanism. Or as part of the trials for a drug, we realize that it has an unanticipated beneficial effect. And the interesting thing about this is if we can identify drugs like this, then it shaves off time and money in trying to bring these drugs to market. So the screening for new drugs and some of the early safety testing is actually shorter because this drug has already been out in the market. We know the side effects, we know the toxicities, so it shaves off some time in some of those safety studies in these drugs. So this is my last slide. These are some candidates. It's not all of them, but these are some interesting candidates that are being looked at in drug repurposing for Parkinson's disease. Some of these you may already have heard of. There's an antihypertensive that's being looked at for maybe preventing cell death in Parkinson's. There's one for respiratory disease that may help cells more efficiently get rid of waste proteins like alpha-synuclein. There are diabetes drugs that maybe also may change the nature of the degeneration that's going on. There may be drugs that symptomatically, like buspirone, which is an old anxiolytic, old anti-anxiety medication that may be useful in treating the abnormal movements that we call dyskinesias. And probably a lot of people here have heard about nilotinib, an anti-cancer drug or anti-leukemia drug that's gained a lot of interest in the media, is that it might help clear the toxic protein alpha-synuclein that accumulates in Parkinson's disease. So this is a very active area of research, and actually many funding groups now are putting money to help, while they're still actively investigating new drugs, they're also putting a lot of money in to see if some of these therapies might be useful. So in summary, clinical trials assess the safety and efficacy of new interventions on people with certain conditions. It's a long and arduous process, and maybe drug repurposing may help bring newer drugs to the market faster. We definitely need research volunteers. It is the only way we can move research forward. There are wonderful benefits, both for people or for society as a whole, but there can be some risks, and so people must be aware of that. But we do have many safeguards in place to make sure that people aren't exposed to a lot of risk, and we try to keep everybody safe as we can. Thank you very much.